Close your eyes. Listen to the hush of the ocean, a stillness broken only by the whisper of waves against steel. It is night in the Pacific, 1944, and far beneath the moonlit surface, a predator waits in silence. The submarine is USS Tang. Her commander, Richard O'Kane, calm, watchful, steady at the periscope. Above him lies an empire built on ships. Japan, stretched thin across the Pacific, living and breathing through its lifelines of supply. Without those ships, the empire starves. And on this night, in these waters, the hunter prepares to strike. The men aboard Tang are silent, hands tight on valves, torpedo tubes primed, every breath shallow in the red-lit control room. They know their captain's reputation. He does not play it safe. He does not linger in shadows. He strikes close, dangerously close, slipping between convoys where no submarine dares to go. And when he gives the order, torpedoes race into the Black Sea. Seconds stretch like hours. Then fire blossoms across the horizon. Another freighter split open. Another convoy broken. Another lifeline cut. The ocean is vast, but Imperial Japan depends on narrow veins of supply. Oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber, rice, and raw materials carried in endless chains of freighters. And in those chains, USS Tang is the knife. By the end of the war, she will sink more ships than any other submarine. She will earn her place as the deadliest hunter beneath the waves. But her story is more than a tally of ships destroyed. It is the story of how silence strangled an empire. O'Kane's tactics redefined submarine warfare. He stalked at night, surfaced boldly among convoys, attacked so close that Japanese gunners could see the wake of Tang's torpedoes. He turned the very danger of proximity into his weapon, making every battle not just an attack, but a lesson in calculated risk and unshakable leadership. Yet the sea gives as much as it takes, and Tang's story, like all legends, carries both triumph and tragedy. On her final patrol, with victory near at hand, fate would deal the cruelest blow. A single torpedo, circling back, sealing the submarine's fate. But tonight, in this story, we begin at the height of her hunt. The ocean is quiet, but the silence is heavy with purpose. One submarine, one crew, one commander, against an empire's lifelines. This is the story of USS Tang versus Imperial Japan, the story of how steel, silence, and courage beneath the waves changed the course of a war and strangled an empire from within. The war in the Pacific was unlike any other. It stretched across vast oceans, islands scattered like stepping stones, supply lines reaching thousands of miles. Japan's empire, powerful at its height, was built on those lifelines. Oil from the Dutch East Indies, rice and rubber from Southeast Asia, weapons, men, and resources carried in endless convoys. Every ship was a vein, every freighter was a heartbeat, and without them, the empire could not survive. Against this ocean of lifelines, the United States unleashed its silent service, the submarines of the Pacific Fleet, fewer than 200 boats, fewer than 10,000 men. But their mission was clear: cut the lifelines, strangle the empire, and bring Japan to its knees. At first, the task seemed impossible. The Japanese Navy ruled the seas, its convoys guarded by destroyers bristling with depth charges, its skies patrolled by planes with sharp eyes. And American submarines themselves were flawed in the early years. Their torpedoes often ran shallow. Their detonators often failed. Sailors risked their lives on weapons that might not even explode. Still, the submariners pressed on. Patrol after patrol, they hunted in silence. Long days spent submerged at periscope depth, creeping like shadows beneath the waves. long nights rising to the surface, batteries charging, fresh air flooding the steel hull. Every patrol was a gamble, survival balanced on luck, skill, and the captain's judgment. The submariners called themselves the Silent Service, not just because their missions were secret, but because their world was one of whispers and stillness, the hum of engines, the faint drip of condensation in the control room, the quiet clatter of typewriters in the wardroom. The only loud sounds were the ones every man dreaded: the ping of an enemy sonar, the rush of depth charges falling through the sea, the thunder of explosions that shook the boat to its very bolts. Life aboard was tight, hot, and heavy. 80 men crammed into a steel tube less than 300 feet long, bunks stacked in narrow corridors, mess tables that doubled as desks, air thick with diesel fumes and sweat. Privacy was a dream. Comfort was a memory. Yet the men endured, not for luxury, but for duty, for each other. And despite the hardships, the Silent Service grew deadlier with every patrol. By 1943, American submarines were cutting deeper into Japan's supply lines, sinking tankers and freighters at a staggering rate. The empire began to starve. Fuel shortages crippled its navy. Food shortages weakened its people. The Great War Machine, stretched across the Pacific, began to choke. Still, no submarine captured the spirit of this war within a war quite like the USS Tang. Commissioned in 1943, she was small by battleship standards, but swift, lethal, and commanded by a man whose name would echo in history, Richard O'Kane. O'Kane was no stranger to the Silent Service. He had already served as executive officer aboard the legendary USS Wahoo under Commander Dudley "Mush" Morton. From Morton, he learned boldness, daring, the art of taking the fight directly to the enemy. But O'Kane also saw the cost of recklessness, the fine line between bravery and danger. When the Navy handed him the command of Tang, he carried both lessons within him. He believed that a submarine was more than steel and torpedoes. It was a living thing, shaped by the trust, loyalty, and courage of its crew. He led not from behind, but from the bridge, at the periscope, in the danger itself. His presence steadied his men. His silence inspired their confidence. Under O'Kane, Tang would do more than patrol. She would stalk the Empire's lifelines with unmatched precision, daring, and innovation. She would strike at night, surface among convoys, fire torpedoes from point-blank range, then vanish before the enemy could respond. In less than 2 years, Tang would sink more ships, destroy more tonnage, and strike more fear than any other submarine in the Silent Service. But all of that lay ahead. In the beginning, in those first days of command, O'Kane knew the weight of history rested not just on his shoulders, but on the steel hull of his boat and the hearts of his crew. Together, they were part of something greater, a silent war beneath the waves, a war fought not with massive fleets and thunderous guns, but with patience, precision, and the courage to wait in silence until the moment to strike arrived. And so the Silent Service prepared the stage. Above the water, convoys carried the lifeblood of an empire. Below, submarines like Tang waited, listening, watching, ready. In the stillness of the Pacific, where silence itself became a weapon, the deadliest hunt of the war was about to begin. Richard Hetherington O'Kane, born in Dover, New Hampshire, in 1911, a quiet New England town, far from the thunder of war, far from the rolling waves of the Pacific. Yet from childhood, he carried the sea in his heart. After graduating from the U.S. Naval Academy in 1934, he stepped into a world on the edge of conflict, a world soon to be consumed by fire and steel. In the years before war, O'Kane served on surface ships, but it was beneath the waves that he found his calling. By 1938, he had requested submarine duty, trading the open decks for cramped steel corridors and the vast horizon for the narrow lens of a periscope. Then came 1941, Pearl Harbor, the day the ocean burned. For America, the war in the Pacific had begun. For O'Kane, it was the beginning of a journey that would define his life and the lives of every man who followed him. He first rose to prominence aboard the USS Wahoo under Commander Dudley "Mush" Morton, a bold, unorthodox leader whose daring tactics stunned both friend and foe. Morton trusted O'Kane as his executive officer, his right hand, the man who would stand at the periscope while he commanded attacks. From Morton, O'Kane learned the power of aggression, the belief that submarines should not merely shadow convoys from a distance, but charge headlong into them, striking at the heart of Japan's supply lines. Under Morton, Wahoo earned a reputation as a wolf of the Pacific, and O'Kane earned the respect of his peers as a calm, fearless officer, steady even in chaos. But O'Kane also learned something else from his time on Wahoo. He saw how thin the line could be between daring and reckless. He saw the heavy toll risk could take when fortune turned against them. And in those lessons, he found a balance that would later shape his own command style. Bold but measured, innovative but disciplined. By 1943, the Navy saw in O'Kane more than just a capable officer. They saw a leader ready to command his own boat. His promotion came with the commissioning of a new Belau-class submarine, USS Tang. Sleek, fast, armed with the latest torpedoes, she was to be his weapon, his responsibility, his family. On her deck, under the Hawaiian sun at Pearl Harbor, O'Kane first addressed his crew. His voice was calm, not booming, his manner steady, not flamboyant. He told them that their strength lay not in numbers nor in noise, but in silence, precision, and trust. A submarine was more than steel and machinery. It was the men inside her. Every hand mattered. Every decision mattered. And as their captain, he would never ask them to face a danger he would not face himself. In those words, his men found confidence. In his presence, they found calm. For in the stillness before battle, when fear pressed heavily in their chests, they knew their captain would be there, steady at the periscope, calm under pressure, unshaken by the roar of depth charges above. When USS Tang slipped into the Pacific on her first war patrol, the men carried not just weapons of war, but a bond of trust in each other, and trust in the man who led them. O'Kane's philosophy was simple yet profound. Lead from the front, take responsibility for every risk, and share every burden. And soon, the Empire of Japan would learn what that meant. For in O'Kane, the silent service had found its deadliest hunter. And in Tang, the Pacific had found a blade of steel sharpened by discipline, daring, and determination. As the submarine vanished into the endless blue, few could know that she was beginning a journey that would rewrite the history of submarine warfare. And at her helm, Richard O'Kane, quiet, calm, resolute, was ready to lead his men into the shadows of the Pacific, ready to take command of destiny itself. The Pacific was vast, and yet in 1944, it felt small for those who sailed Japan's convoys. Every ship that left port, every tanker that carried oil from the South Seas, every freighter heavy with rice and weapons, risked vanishing into silence. For beneath the waves, the hunter waited. USS Tang's first war patrol began in early 1944. The crew was new, the boat was fresh, but O'Kane's leadership was already shaping them into a single, breathing organism. He had drilled them endlessly in torpedo loading, crash dives, silent running. He taught them that precision was their shield and silence was their greatest weapon. From the moment Tang slipped into enemy waters, O'Kane revealed his style. He refused to linger at the edges of convoys. Where others waited for openings, he made them. He preferred to strike at night, surfacing boldly among the ships, weaving through destroyers and tankers as though daring fate itself. The crew, at first, felt the tension of these attacks. Imagine the scene. The submarine on the surface, the black horizon filled with shadows of enemy ships, their running lights faint in the distance. The moonlight glints off steel, off waves, off the periscope. In that moment, every man holds his breath, waiting for the captain's word. O'Kane's calm voice cuts through the tension. Fire 1, fire 2, fire 3. Torpedoes roar out, leaving white trails through the dark water. The men count the seconds. 1, 2, 10, and then thunder. A freighter split apart, a tanker erupting in flame, chaos spreading through the convoy. But even as searchlights cut across the water and destroyers turn to charge, O'Kane does not flinch. His commands are steady, his decisions crisp. He maneuvers the Tang between the very ships hunting him, turning the confusion of the enemy into his shield. On that first patrol, Tang sank ship after ship, leaving behind burning wreckage and terrified survivors clinging to rafts. The Japanese Navy, once confident in its convoys, began to fear the darkness of the sea. Whispers spread. An American submarine was hunting them with uncanny daring, striking at point-blank range, escaping where none should escape. For the men aboard Tang, these victories built more than pride. They built trust. Trust in their captain's instincts, in their own courage, in the steel hull that carried them through danger. Each success was a reminder that silence, precision, and daring could topple even the mightiest empire. By the end of her early patrols, Tang had already earned a reputation among submariners as something extraordinary. She was not just another boat in the silent service. She was a predator unlike any other. And Richard O'Kane was proving himself not only as a skilled commander, but as a master of fear. Fear turned outward against the enemy, never inward toward his own men. Japan's lifelines were long, fragile, and exposed, and with every patrol, Tang's teeth cut deeper. The Empire, so confident in its dominance of the sea, was beginning to choke. The first patrols were only the beginning, but already O'Kane and his crew had shown the world that one submarine, led with daring and calm resolve, could strike fear into an empire. Japan's empire was vast, stretching from the islands of the home islands to the jungles of Burma, the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, the rice paddies of Indochina. But such an empire was fragile, bound together not by land, but by sea. Every gallon of oil, every ton of rice, every bullet and every soldier had to move by ship. The ocean was Japan's highway and its lifeline. Richard O'Kane understood this better than most. He knew that a submarine's true weapon was not only its torpedoes, but its ability to strangle supply. Every freighter sunk, every tanker lost, was more than a tally. It was a blow to the Empire's heart. On patrol after patrol, USS Tang hunted with relentless precision. Tankers carrying precious oil were prime targets, for without fuel, Japan's warships were useless. Freighters loaded with rice and grain were destroyed, leaving shortages for soldiers and civilians alike. Ammunition ships, troop transports, even small supply vessels, nothing escaped O'Kane's eye. By mid-1944, Tang's impact was devastating. Entire convoys vanished beneath the waves. Ships that once carried lifeblood to the Empire were left burning, broken, or silent wrecks resting on the ocean floor. Japanese sailors began to fear the unseen predator lurking in the dark. The numbers told a grim story. In just a handful of patrols, Tang had sunk dozens of ships, totaling more than 100,000 tons. Her attacks came so swiftly, so boldly, that many Japanese captains believed more than one submarine had struck. But it was not many. It was one. One boat, one crew, one commander. And Japan felt the choke. By 1945, fuel reserves were dwindling. Warships sat idle in port for lack of oil. Factories slowed as raw materials stopped arriving. Civilians went hungry as food supplies shrank. The empire that had once stretched wide across the Pacific was beginning to starve, not from lack of courage, but from lack of ships. Life aboard Tang was not easy during these hunts. The men lived in cramped quarters, the air thick with diesel fumes, the steel hull groaning under pressure. Depth charges rattled their nerves. Enemy aircraft forced them below for hours at a time, and the constant strain of war weighed heavily. Yet they endured, because they knew the importance of their mission. They were not just sinking ships, they were cutting the veins of an empire. O'Kane reminded his crew often that their fight was not for glory, but for necessity. Every torpedo that struck was another step toward ending the war, another step toward saving lives on distant battlefields. In silence, in patience, in steel resolve, they carried the war on their shoulders, and the Japanese could not stop them. Destroyers swept the seas, aircraft scanned the waters, convoys tightened their defenses. But still, the Tang struck. O'Kane's tactics, surface attacks at night, weaving through convoys, firing at point-blank range, turned the very heart of enemy strength into weakness. Convoys that once protected Japan's lifelines became traps of confusion, torn apart by a predator hidden in plain sight. By now, the silent service had earned its name not only for secrecy, but for effect. Submarines accounted for over half of Japan's merchant fleet losses. They were not just hunters, they were stranglers. The war above the waves was decided as much by the silence below as by the thunder of fleets and armies. And in that silent war, no submarine embodied the mission more than USS Tang. She was the knife at Japan's throat, and Richard O'Kane was the hand that wielded it. By 1944, Japan was gasping. The empire that had roared so loudly just 3 years before was faltering in silence, and deep beneath the waves, Tang's crew knew their war was not yet done. The lifelines still pulsed, and they would strike again. The sea is never the same twice. The enemy changes, the currents shift, the weapons fail. And in war, those who cling to old habits are the first to be swallowed by the deep. Richard O'Kane knew this truth. It was not enough to be brave. It was not enough to be precise. To survive, to win, one had to adapt. And aboard USS Tang, innovation was as much a weapon as any torpedo. From the first patrols, O'Kane broke from convention. Where other captains preferred to stalk convoys from afar, firing from the shadows, O'Kane charged in. At night, he surfaced boldly, racing through the very heart of enemy formations. The Japanese were stunned. A submarine was supposed to hide, not stand tall among destroyers and freighters. But O'Kane turned that expectation into his shield. The chaos of convoys became his cover, their very size their undoing. When torpedoes failed, and many did in those years, O'Kane refused to accept defeat. He studied their flaws, he adjusted his angles, he changed attack patterns. He taught his men to expect the unexpected, to fire, observe, and adapt instantly. A dud torpedo was not the end of a hunt. It was a puzzle to be solved. Inside the control room, his calm voice guided the crew through every maneuver. Left rudder, periscope depth, steady on course. Each command was precise, measured, deliberate. Yet behind those words was a mind constantly adapting, reshaping old tactics, inventing new ones, testing limits others feared to test. He was among the first to perfect rapid-fire torpedo spreads, launching quickly. Before the enemy could react, he pushed his men to reload faster than ever, sometimes in less than 10 minutes, keeping Tang's fangs ready for the next strike. He demanded silence when needed, speed when required, boldness when opportunity appeared. The enemy adapted too. Convoys tightened their defenses. Destroyers swarmed the seas. Depth charges rained like thunder. Aircraft scoured the waves. But O'Kane answered every move with one of his own. He altered patterns, struck from unexpected angles, attacked when others would retreat. His creativity kept Tang alive, and his daring made her deadly. For the crew, these lessons were not just tactics, they were survival. Each man knew that to live, he had to think, to adapt, to trust his captain's vision. And with every patrol, their bond grew stronger, their confidence deeper. They became more than sailors. They became innovators, warriors in silence, carrying out attacks no one else dared attempt. It was this spirit of adaptation that gave Tang her reputation as the deadliest submarine of the war. Not because she had more torpedoes, not because her steel was stronger, but because her captain and crew refused to fight by yesterday's rules. And yet, O'Kane's innovations were not born of recklessness. He understood the fine line between boldness and disaster. Every risk was weighed, every tactic sharpened by experience. His daring was calculated, his improvisation rooted in discipline. That balance between courage and caution, tradition and invention, was what made him unlike any other commander in the silent service. Japan's convoys grew weaker with every patrol, their lifelines severed, their ships scattered. And in the shadows of that collapse, USS Tang carved her name into history. The empire had once seemed unbreakable, but O'Kane proved that even the strongest chains can be broken, not with brute force, but with innovation, adaptation, and the courage to see differently. And so, beneath the vast silence of the Pacific, Tang hunted not just with torpedoes, but with imagination. And imagination, sharpened by discipline, became the deadliest weapon of all. By late 1944, the USS Tang had already carved her legend into the sea. She had sunk ship after ship, convoy after convoy, but it was her final patrol, the fifth, that would etch her name forever into history. In October, Tang slipped quietly into the Formosa Strait, a narrow artery between China and Taiwan. The waters were crowded with Japanese shipping, troop transports, freighters, oil tankers, all guarded by destroyers desperate to keep the empire alive. To most, it was a death trap. To O'Kane, it was opportunity. For days, Tang stalked convoys with patience and precision. By night, O'Kane surfaced boldly, slipping between ships, firing at point-blank range. Torpedoes roared from her tubes, explosions split the horizon, and chaos tore through the convoys. Japanese ships scattered in panic, their lifelines shredded. One night alone, O'Kane's men watched in awe as their captain fired into a column of transports, sending 5 ships to the bottom in minutes. Survivors clung to wreckage, fires lit the sky, and the strait echoed with thunder. The crew knew then they were part of something no submarine had ever done. By the end of the patrol, Tang had sunk more than 10 ships, destroying over 40,000 tons of vital shipping. Her total record across 5 patrols would reach 33 ships over 100,000 tons, the most of any American submarine in the war. Newspapers back home would later call her the deadliest submarine of World War II. And yet, the ocean is a place of silence and irony. For even as victory crowned her name, fate was preparing its cruelest twist. On October 24th, O'Kane fired his last torpedo at a crippled transport. The weapon left the tube, curved sharply, and circled back. In the blackness of night, no one saw until it was too late. The torpedo struck Tang's stern with a blinding flash. Steel twisted, compartments flooded, men were thrown into the sea. In seconds, the predator had become the prey. Of the crew, only 9 survived the explosion and the ocean's grip. O'Kane himself was pulled into the water, clinging to wreckage as his boat, his family, slipped beneath the waves forever. Captured, the survivors were sent to Japanese prison camps, enduring starvation and cruelty until war's end. But even captivity could not erase what Tang had done. Her record stood unmatched. Her name became legend. And Richard O'Kane, though scarred by loss, was remembered not for tragedy alone, but for the courage, daring, and brilliance that had made his submarine the deadliest hunter of the Pacific. The Deadliest Patrol was both triumph and heartbreak, proof that even legends are born of both victory and sacrifice. The night was calm, the stars barely glimmering above the Formosa Strait, but beneath the waves, tension coiled like a spring. It was October 24th, 1944. The Tang had already torn through the Japanese convoys, sinking ship after ship in a patrol that would be remembered forever. She had only 2 torpedoes left, 2 final shots in her arsenal. Richard O'Kane, standing at the periscope, made his choice. He targeted a crippled transport, sitting dead in the water. The command was given. Fire. The first torpedo left the tube. The crew held their breath. Seconds stretched into eternity. And then, nothing. A dud. Frustration flickered, but O'Kane did not waver. He ordered the second shot. The second torpedo slid free into the dark water. But something was wrong. Almost immediately, the weapon curved sharply. Instead of streaking forward, it turned in a deadly arc. One sailor gasped, "It's coming back at us." In the darkness, there was no time, no chance to evade. The sea erupted in fire and thunder as the torpedo slammed into the stern of the Tang. The submarine shook violently. Steel screamed and twisted. Compartments flooded in seconds. The proud hunter of the Pacific had been struck down by her own weapon. Men scrambled, some thrown into the sea by the force of the blast. Within moments, the Tang began to sink. For those trapped inside, the silence of the ocean became their tomb. O'Kane himself was thrown into the black water, stunned but alive. He clung to wreckage, watching helplessly as his beloved boat disappeared beneath the waves. All around him, the cries of his crew mingled with the hiss of steam and the roar of the sea. Of the 87 men aboard, only 9 would survive. They floated in the open water, cold and broken, until Japanese patrol boats arrived. The survivors were captured, beaten, and dragged into captivity. For the rest of the war, they endured brutal conditions in prison camps: hunger, disease, cruelty. Many would never fully recover. For O'Kane, the pain was deeper than captivity. He had lost his men, his brothers, his family at sea. And yet, he carried their story. He carried the memory of Tang. The tragedy in the Formosa Strait was not just the end of a submarine. It was the cruel reminder that the ocean spares no one. Even the most brilliant commander, even the deadliest boat, could be undone by fate and flawed machinery. And yet, within that tragedy, the legend of the Tang only grew. Her record stood unchallenged. Her sacrifice became part of the larger story of courage, innovation, and the unforgiving price of war. The strait that night was both grave and monument, a place where fire and silence wrote the final chapter of America's deadliest submarine. The sea went still after the roar of the explosion. Fragments of steel floated, silence broken only by the waves, and among that silence, 9 men remained alive. Commander Richard O'Kane, bruised and dazed, clung to a piece of wreckage. Around him, shadows of his crew surfaced one by one, exhausted, bleeding, stripped of the submarine that had been their home. They drifted together, bound not by hope, but by survival. Hours passed. The night stretched endlessly. The water was cold. The salt stung their wounds. And yet, they held on. When dawn came, the glimmer of rescue appeared. But it was not salvation. Japanese patrol boats found them. Their bodies were pulled aboard, rough hands striking them, blows raining down as punishment. The men of the Tang were no longer warriors. They were prisoners. From that moment, their world narrowed into darkness. Prison camps, barbed wire, wooden barracks where cold seeped in through thin walls, guards who saw them not as men, but as enemies to be broken. The days blurred. Food was a thin bowl of rice, sometimes spoiled, sometimes not at all. Hunger gnawed at their stomachs. Disease spread quietly, stealing strength. The cruelty was constant. Beatings, insults, humiliation. Every sunrise was another test of endurance. O'Kane, their commander, carried a weight heavier than chains. He was alive, but his boat was gone. His men, so many of them, lost to the sea. In captivity, he became both prisoner and leader. His quiet determination kept others from despair. A whispered word, a steady look, the belief that somehow they would see home again. He thought often of his wife, of freedom, of the ocean that had taken so much and yet had given him purpose. The memories of patrols past, the victories, the daring attacks, became stories retold among the prisoners, small sparks of pride to fight the cold. Months stretched into years. The war raged outside the camp's walls, but inside, time was measured by survival. O'Kane watched comrades fall ill. He saw the cost of resilience written on every thin face, and still, he endured. Then came 1945. The world shifted. The tide of war turned. News trickled in like whispers. Japan was faltering. The prisoners could feel it, in the hesitation of guards, in the sudden quiet. And finally, liberation came. The gates opened. Soldiers walked free, not in triumph, but in staggering relief. O'Kane emerged thin, worn, changed. He had survived, but never untouched. Captivity had carved deep scars. And yet, it also gave him clarity. His mission was not only to fight, but to remember, to carry the names of those who had gone with Tang. The war had taken much from Richard O'Kane, but it had not taken his spirit. He returned home carrying both grief and honor, a living testament to the price of courage and the endurance of the human soul. When Richard O'Kane returned home, the war was over, but in his eyes, it was never truly finished. The memory of the Tang, the faces of his crew, followed him like shadows. Yet the nation saw something else. They saw not a prisoner, not a man broken by loss, but a hero. His daring patrols, his relentless courage, his unmatched skill had rewritten the very book of submarine warfare. In March of 1946, Richard O'Kane stood tall in a Navy uniform once more. Before him, the President of the United States. In his hands, the Medal of Honor, the highest recognition of valor. It was placed upon him not for one act, but for many, for the bold attacks, for the convoys destroyed, for the lifelines severed, for the way he led his men, always at the front, always with calm resolve. As the medal's ribbon rested on his chest, O'Kane felt not triumph, but absence. The cheers of the crowd could not fill the silence left by the men who did not return. And so, he accepted not for himself alone, but for every sailor of the Tang who had gone down with their boat. In the years that followed, O'Kane carried his story with quiet dignity. He remained in the Navy, training a new generation of submariners, passing on the lessons forged in fire and steel. His words were not of glory, but of caution, discipline, and courage. Later, he turned to writing, pouring memory into ink. His book, Clear the Bridge, became a testament not only to tactics, but to the spirit of the men who lived and died beneath the waves. Through his voice, the story of the Tang was preserved, so the world would never forget. Even in his later years, O'Kane remained a symbol. To the Navy, he was the master of the submarine, a commander whose instincts changed the war. To his crew's families, he was the keeper of memory. And to history, he became something more, a reminder that true leadership is measured not in victories alone, but in sacrifice, in resilience, in the ability to carry others through darkness. Richard O'Kane's legacy lives not just in medals, not just in books, but in the silence of the ocean, where the name Tang still echoes, as both triumph and tragedy. In the quiet years that followed, Richard O'Kane lived a life touched by memory. He retired from the Navy, but the sea never left him. Every wave, every horizon carried echoes of the Tang. At his desk, in the glow of a simple lamp, he wrote, not of himself, but of his men, their courage, their laughter, their sacrifice. Through his memoirs, he gave them a voice that time could not erase. As the decades passed, O'Kane grew older, but his presence remained steady. To young submariners, he was not just a hero, he was a teacher, a living bridge to the past. And to families of the fallen, he was a bearer of truth, someone who carried the memory of their loved ones with reverence. In 1994, Richard O'Kane passed away at the age of 83. He was laid to rest with honor, a Medal of Honor on his record, but far greater, a legacy etched in courage. Today, when submarines sail silently beneath the waves, his lessons endure. His name whispers through the deep, reminding us that leadership, sacrifice, and memory are the truest victories of all.